It was a warm, sunny afternoon, and Derek, a loving father, was taking his son Jamal to the local park. Jamal had been excited all week for this moment. It had been a while since they had spent quality time together, and Derek wanted to make sure his son had fun. They walked hand in hand through the park, laughing and talking about everything and anything. Jamal's favorite part of the day was when they would stop by the ice cream truck near the playground. The sweet smell of vanilla and chocolate filled the air as Derek smiled at his son, feeling proud of the young boy he was becoming. Jamal had been talking nonstop, sharing stories from school and asking about his dad's work. Derek enjoyed these moments, the simple joys of fatherhood. It felt good to take a break from their busy lives and just be together in the sunshine. As they passed the swings, Jamal begged his dad to push him higher, and Derek couldn't resist. He set Jamal on the swing and began to push him gently, watching as his son's face lit up with excitement. The park was peaceful, with a few other families enjoying the day, and Derek couldn't help but feel at peace. But then something unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, a voice broke through the serenity. A police officer, tall and stern, approached them. Derek stopped pushing the swing, confused by the sudden appearance of the officer. The officer's gaze was intense, and it made Derek feel uneasy. "Excuse me, sir. I need to speak with you," the officer said, his voice cold and commanding. Derek looked at the officer, unsure of what was going on. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked politely, hoping it was just a misunderstanding. The officer's eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid I've received a report that you're kidnapping this child," he said, pointing at Jamal, who had stopped swinging and was now standing beside his father, looking confused and scared. Derek's heart skipped a beat. "What? Kidnapping?" "This is my son, Jamal," Derek said, his voice shaking with disbelief. He stepped closer to his son, instinctively protective. The officer didn't seem convinced. "We've had a report of a child being taken, and you match the description. I need to ask you a few questions." Derek's mind was racing. He looked around the park, but the crowd seemed to ignore the situation, not realizing what was happening. The officer took out his phone and began to make a call, speaking in low tones. Derek felt the weight of the situation growing heavier with each passing second. Jamal, still holding his father's hand, was becoming increasingly scared, his eyes wide as he tried to make sense of it all. "I don't understand," Derek said, trying to remain calm for his son. "There must be some mistake. I'm not kidnapping anyone. This is my son, and we've just come to the park for a few hours of fun. Please, you have to believe me." But the officer didn't seem to hear him. The situation was growing more tense with every word that passed. Derek could feel the eyes of bystanders on him, some of them whispering and others staring. He wanted to explain himself, to make them understand, but it felt like his words were falling on deaf ears. The officer turned back to him, the disbelief still clear on his face. "I'll need to verify your identity," the officer said, his tone unyielding. "Please stay where you are." Derek took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew he had to get through this somehow, but the weight of the situation was crushing him. Jamal squeezed his father's hand, his small fingers trembling. Derek looked at his son, giving him a reassuring smile, though inside, he was anything but calm. The uncertainty of the moment made everything feel surreal. Was this really happening? Derek couldn't understand how things had escalated so quickly. All he wanted was a peaceful day at the park with his son, not this nightmare. But the more he tried to explain, the more it felt like the situation was slipping out of his control. As the officer made his call, Derek's thoughts were scattered, his heart heavy with worry for his son. Would they let him go? Would they see the truth before it was too late? The fear in Jamal's eyes was all he needed to keep pushing for answers. As Derek stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening, the officer continued to talk on the phone. Derek could feel his heart racing as he looked at Jamal, who was still holding onto his hand, looking more confused and scared by the second. The park that had once felt like a safe and peaceful place now felt like an unfamiliar and hostile environment. People walked by, some glancing at the scene with curiosity, while others turned away, pretending not to notice. Derek kept repeating the same thing over and over, trying to convince the officer. "This is my son. We're just here to have a fun day at the park. There must be some kind of mistake. Please, you need to believe me." But no matter how many times he said it, the officer seemed unmoved. The look on his face remained stern and unyielding. Derek could see that he wasn't listening to him, and that made the situation feel even worse. It was as if no matter how much he tried to explain himself, the officer had already made up his mind. Jamal, sensing the tension, clung to his father's side a little tighter. Derek tried to give him a comforting smile, but inside, he was terrified. He wanted to hold his son and tell him everything would be okay, but the fear in Jamal's eyes was a painful reminder of how serious things had become. The officer finally finished his call and put his phone away. "I'm going to need to take you both to the station for questioning," he said, his voice cold and firm. Derek felt his stomach drop. "What? No, please. There's no need for that. I'm telling you, I'm not kidnapping him. He's my son." He could feel the panic starting to rise in his chest, but he tried his best to stay calm. He knew that getting upset wouldn't help the situation. The officer ignored his pleas and started walking toward his patrol car, motioning for Derek and Jamal to follow him. "I'll be calling for backup. You'll both be questioned." Derek's mind was spinning. He couldn't believe this was happening. It felt like a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. He glanced around the park again, but this time, the faces in the crowd seemed colder, less friendly. Derek noticed a couple of people standing nearby, watching the whole situation unfold. Some of them whispered to each other, exchanging looks as though they were trying to figure out what was going on. But no one stepped forward to help. No one came to his defense. Jamal's grip tightened on Derek's hand. His small face was filled with confusion, and he kept looking between his father and the officer, not understanding why this was happening. Derek knelt down to his son's level, trying to reassure him. "It's going to be okay, Jamal. Just stay close to me, all right?" Jamal nodded slowly, though his eyes were still wide with fear. "Dad, what's happening?" he asked softly. Derek felt his heart break at the sound of his son's voice. He wanted to promise that everything would be fine, but deep down, he wasn't sure. How could he have known that a simple afternoon at the park would turn into something so terrifying? But he had to stay strong for Jamal, no matter how scared he felt. The officer was now standing by his patrol car, waiting for them to approach. Derek knew that there was nothing he could do except follow. But the weight of the situation was heavy on his chest, and the fear for his son's safety kept growing. What if this wasn't just a misunderstanding? What if the officer was determined to go through with it? Derek stood up and gently pulled Jamal closer to him as they began to walk toward the car. With every step, he felt the tension between them and the officer. They hadn't done anything wrong, yet it felt like they were being punished for something they couldn't even understand. The park, which had once been a place of joy, now felt like a cold, unwelcoming place, full of questions that had no answers. As Derek and Jamal walked toward the officer's patrol car, the air felt thick with tension. Every step seemed to take them further away from the peace they had once felt in the park. Jamal walked close to his father, his small hand still gripping Derek's tightly. Derek could feel his son's body trembling with fear, and it made his own anxiety grow. What if this wasn't just a misunderstanding? What if the officer wasn't going to listen, no matter what Derek said? He had to stay calm for Jamal, but inside, he was struggling. The officer stood by the patrol car, his arms crossed, waiting for them to reach him. Derek's mind was racing. Was he about to be taken to the police station? What would they do to him there? Why had the officer assumed he was kidnapping his own son? The questions flooded Derek's mind, but he couldn't find any answers. "Come on," the officer said, his voice still cold. "Get in the car." Derek didn't move at first. He looked down at Jamal, who was still clutching his father's hand, his eyes wide with confusion. "Jamal, it's going to be okay," Derek said softly, trying to reassure his son, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next. Jamal nodded, but he didn't seem convinced. His eyes darted between the officer and his father, trying to make sense of what was happening. He had never seen his dad like this before, and it made him feel even more uneasy. Derek took a deep breath and finally walked toward the car, still holding Jamal's hand. He knew he had no choice but to follow the officer's orders for now. The situation was beyond his control, and all he could do was hope it would be sorted out soon. The officer motioned for them to get in the back of the patrol car. Derek hesitated for a moment before helping Jamal inside. He tried to keep his movements calm, but inside, his heart was racing. Jamal sat quietly beside him, his eyes wide, trying to understand why they were being treated like this. Derek could feel the weight of his son's fear, and it made his own worry grow even stronger. The officer slammed the door shut after they were inside and walked around to the front of the car. Derek tried to make sense of the situation. How had it escalated this far? He had done everything right. He had tried to stay calm, to explain, but it hadn't worked. Instead, here they were, sitting in the back of a police car for something they hadn't done. As the officer got into the front seat, Derek tried to speak again. "Please, officer," he said, his voice shaking a little. "There's been a mistake. I'm not a kidnapper. This is my son, Jamal. We've been together all day. We were just at the park." But the officer didn't reply. He didn't even look back at Derek. Instead, he started the car and pulled out of the park, driving them toward the station. Derek glanced out the window, watching the familiar sights of the park slip away. What would happen when they got there? Would anyone listen to him? What if the officer didn't believe him, even then? Jamal, sensing his father's tension, leaned into him a little more, pressing his small head against Derek's arm. "Dad, I don't understand. What's going on? Why are we in the car?" Jamal's voice was quiet, full of fear and confusion. Derek's heart broke at the sound of his son's words. "I don't know, son," Derek said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I really don't know, but we'll figure this out. I promise." The drive felt long and uncomfortable, the silence between them growing as heavy as the air inside the car. Derek could feel his mind racing, his thoughts spinning in every direction, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He had to get through this for Jamal. He had to make sure that his son knew they were going to be okay. The patrol car finally came to a stop outside the police station, its tires crunching on the gravel. Derek felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The drive had felt like it took forever, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Jamal sat quietly beside him, still holding his hand, his eyes fixed on the window as if hoping to find some comfort in the passing scenery. But there was no comfort. The reality of the situation had settled in, and Derek wasn't sure what was going to happen next. The officer turned off the engine, and for a moment, neither Derek nor Jamal moved. It was as if they were both waiting for something to change, for some sort of explanation that would make sense of this whole ordeal. But nothing changed. The officer glanced at them through the rearview mirror, but didn't say a word. Derek took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He knew he had to stay calm for Jamal, but inside, the uncertainty was gnawing at him. "Come on," the officer finally said, his tone still firm. He got out of the car and walked toward the station entrance without another word. Derek followed, taking one last look at Jamal, who was still looking up at him with those wide, innocent eyes. Derek gave his son a small nod, silently reassuring him that they would get through this together, no matter what. As they entered the station, Derek was guided into a small waiting room. The officer motioned for him to sit down, and Jamal took a seat next to him. The room was cold and sterile, the bright fluorescent lights above casting an unsettling glow over the faded chairs and outdated magazines on the coffee table. Derek felt a chill in the air, but it wasn't just from the temperature. It was the feeling of being in a place where everything was out of his control. Jamal, sensing the tension, scooted closer to his father, his small hand reaching for Derek's once again. Derek squeezed his son's hand gently, trying to offer him some comfort, even though he was feeling anything but calm. The officer had told them that they would be questioned, but Derek wasn't sure what that even meant. What questions could they possibly ask him that would explain why he had been accused of something so outrageous? The silence in the room was thick, and it seemed to stretch on forever. Derek kept thinking about what had led up to this point, how they had simply been enjoying a day at the park, and how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. What had the officer seen that made him think Derek was a kidnapper? Was it because they didn't match some description? Was it something as simple as the color of their skin that made Derek the target of suspicion? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Another officer, a woman this time, walked in. She was holding a folder and had a serious look on her face, but there was something different about her presence. She didn't seem as eager to judge, and for a moment, Derek thought he might have a chance to explain himself to someone who would actually listen. "Mr. Williams?" she asked, her voice calm and professional. Derek stood up, still holding Jamal's hand. "Yes, that's me," he said, his voice steady despite the tension he still felt. The woman looked at him for a moment, then glanced down at the folder she was holding. "I'm Officer Harris," she said, giving him a nod. "We need to clear up some things. There's been a misunderstanding, and I just need to ask you a few questions." Derek's heart skipped a beat. A misunderstanding. Finally, it seemed like someone might understand. He nodded, trying to hold on to the small hope that things might soon be resolved. Jamal looked up at the officer with curiosity but stayed close to his father, still unsure of what was going on. Derek knelt down to his son's level. "It's okay, Jamal," he said softly. "We're just going to talk to the officer, and then we can go home. Everything will be fine." Jamal nodded, but the unease was still visible in his eyes. He trusted his dad, but this whole situation felt so strange and scary. Officer Harris led Derek and Jamal into another room, a small office with a desk and a few chairs. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and for a moment there was silence. Derek tried to steady his breathing, hoping that the answers he gave would be enough to finally put an end to this madness. Officer Harris sat behind the desk, her eyes studying the folder in front of her. Derek stood beside Jamal, trying to keep his son close, offering a sense of comfort in the midst of this strange and tense situation. Jamal had remained quiet ever since they entered the room, his wide eyes flicking between the officer and his dad, unsure of what would happen next. "Mr. Williams, I understand this situation has been stressful, but I need you to remain calm," Officer Harris said, her tone firm but not unfriendly. Derek nodded, doing his best to hold it together for Jamal's sake. He had never been in a situation like this before, and the uncertainty was beginning to weigh heavily on him. "We've had a report from a concerned citizen who thought they saw a child being taken by someone matching your description," Officer Harris continued. She paused and looked up at Derek, her expression softening slightly. "Now, I understand this is all very confusing, and I'm sure it's a mistake, but we need to make sure everything is clear." Derek's heart raced. "I'm not sure how this could have happened," he said, trying to explain himself once again. "This is my son, Jamal. We've been together all day, just hanging out in the park. There's no kidnapping, no strange man, nothing. I'm just a father spending time with my child." Officer Harris nodded as she listened, but she didn't seem entirely convinced yet. Derek could tell she was doing her job, following the procedure, but he couldn't help but feel frustrated. He just wanted this whole thing to be over. All he had wanted was a simple day with Jamal, and now here they were, stuck in this small, sterile room, caught up in a misunderstanding that seemed to be spiraling out of control. Jamal had been unusually quiet, his face buried in his father's side, his small frame pressed against Derek's leg, as though trying to find solace in his dad's presence. Derek wanted so badly to make his son feel safe again, to reassure him that everything was going to be okay. But it was hard to believe it himself. How could he convince the officer that he wasn't a criminal when it felt like the world was turning against him? "I can show you proof," Derek said, his voice steady but his hands shaking. "I can show you pictures of Jamal and me, our family, anything that proves he's my son. I don't understand why you think I'm doing something wrong. There must be a mistake." Officer Harris looked at him, her expression neutral, but Derek could tell she was starting to soften. She didn't seem like someone who was quick to judge. "I'll need to confirm a few things," she said, her voice still calm. "But I assure you, this is just standard procedure. We're going to get to the bottom of this." Derek nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. At least Officer Harris wasn't treating him like a criminal. She was listening. She was giving him a chance to explain. That was more than he could say for the officer in the park. He just had to trust that this misunderstanding would be cleared up soon. As Officer Harris began to make a call to verify Derek's information, a thought struck him. What if the whole thing was about something as simple as a mistaken identity? Could it be that someone had seen him with Jamal and assumed the worst? The idea of it made Derek's stomach turn. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, caught in a situation that he never could have imagined. Jamal finally spoke, his voice small and hesitant. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" His question, so simple and innocent, hit Derek hard. His son was scared, and there was nothing he could do to take that fear away. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he had to stay strong for Jamal. Derek kneeled down and pulled his son into a tight hug. "We're going to be fine, Jamal," he said softly. "I promise you. Just stay with me. Everything will be okay." As Officer Harris finished her call, Derek could feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe this could all be sorted out. Maybe they wouldn't be stuck in this room for much longer. But as the officer hung up the phone and looked at him, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that things were still far from over. The tension in the small room was thick as Officer Harris hung up the phone. Derek stood anxiously, waiting for any sign that things would finally start to make sense. Jamal was still pressed close to his side, his tiny hand gripping Derek's arm as if afraid to let go. Derek could feel his son's unease, but he tried to keep his own emotions in check, hoping his calmness would help reassure Jamal. Officer Harris looked up at Derek after hanging up the phone. She didn't seem as stern as before, but her expression was still serious. For a moment, there was silence. Derek could hear the faint hum of the station outside the room, but it didn't make him feel any better. He knew the situation wasn't over. They still had no idea what would happen next. "Mr. Williams," Officer Harris said, her voice calm but firm. "I'd just spoken with the person who made the report. They described seeing a child in distress, and the person they saw with him matched your description. But I've also spoken to a few witnesses, and after hearing all sides, it seems we've made a mistake." Derek felt a weight lift from his chest, but there was still a lingering sense of disbelief. A mistake? Could it really be that simple? "I'm going to need to ask you for some documentation to verify your relationship with Jamal," Officer Harris continued, but there was a hint of understanding in her voice now. "Once I confirm everything, we can clear this up and let you both go." Derek nodded quickly. "Of course," he said, relieved that they were finally getting somewhere. "I've got my ID and Jamal's birth certificate in my wallet. I can show you everything you need." He quickly pulled out his wallet and handed over the necessary papers, his hands slightly trembling as he did. Jamal, sensing his father's nervousness, looked up at him with a small frown. Derek smiled down at him, trying to keep things light. "See, everything's going to be okay." Jamal didn't say anything, but Derek could tell that his son was still trying to make sense of the situation. Jamal's innocent confusion only made Derek's heart ache more. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Officer Harris took the papers, flipping through them carefully, her eyes scanning each one. Derek watched her closely, hoping that this would be the moment when the whole ordeal was finally put to rest. He knew it was just a matter of proving they were who they said they were, but the fear of what might happen if they didn't believe him still lingered in the back of his mind. "All right," Officer Harris said after a few moments, looking up from the papers. "Everything checks out. I verified your information, and it's clear there's been a misunderstanding." Derek let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked at Jamal, who was now watching the officer with wide eyes, still uncertain about what had just happened. Derek's heart swelled with relief, but he didn't let his guard down completely. It had taken far too long for this to be cleared up. "You're free to go," Officer Harris added, standing up from her desk. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Williams. I know this has been difficult, but we had to be thorough. Thank you for your patience." Derek nodded, still a little shaken, but grateful that it was finally over. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, though his thoughts were a whirlwind. "We just wanted to spend a day together. I never imagined it would end like this." As they made their way to the door, Derek glanced down at Jamal, who had finally let go of his grip on his father's arm. Jamal was still a little quiet, but he seemed to be feeling a bit more at ease now. "Let's go home, buddy," Derek said, smiling at his son. Jamal smiled back, a little unsure, but still trusting his dad. As they left the station, Derek couldn't help but feel the weight of the experience pressing on him. The relief of being cleared, mixed with the frustration of how quickly things had escalated, made him realize just how quickly a peaceful day could turn into something terrifying. But it was over. They were going home. As they stepped out of the police station and into the bright afternoon sunlight, Derek finally allowed himself to relax just a little. It wasn't much, but for the first time in hours, he could breathe again. The misunderstanding had been cleared up, but the memory of it would stick with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the process, and he wasn't sure what it was yet. He glanced down at Jamal, who was looking up at him with a soft, trusting smile, and suddenly, the whole world felt a little bit lighter. Maybe the day had been ruined, but at least they were together, and they would make sure to cherish the moments they had left. The car ride back home was quiet, but the silence felt different now. It was no longer heavy with tension and fear, but with relief. Derek couldn't stop looking at Jamal in the rearview mirror, trying to read the expression on his son's face. Jamal's small figure was nestled in the back seat, his eyes staring out the window, his thoughts a mystery to Derek. Derek couldn't blame him for being quiet. The day had been overwhelming. What was supposed to be a simple afternoon in the park had turned into a whirlwind of confusion and fear. And it wasn't just Jamal who had been shaken by the events. It was Derek too. He had never in his life imagined that something like this could happen to them. All he had done was take his son to the park, a place that should have been safe. As they drove through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, Derek tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the police station, to the officer's words, to the way Jamal had looked at him with those scared eyes. It wasn't easy to forget how quickly the situation had spiraled out of control. He felt a sense of guilt that he couldn't shake, even though he knew there was nothing he could have done differently. "Dad." Jamal's voice broke the silence, soft and tentative. Derek's heart gave a small leap, grateful for the sound of his son's voice. "Yeah, buddy," Derek replied, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "I'm really scared," Jamal admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what was happening. Why did the police think you were taking me?" He trailed off, unsure how to phrase his question. Derek's heart ached at the honesty in his son's voice. It wasn't just the fact that Jamal had been scared. It was the fact that Derek hadn't been able to protect him from that fear. He had always promised himself that he would keep Jamal safe, no matter what. But in that moment, he hadn't been able to stop the fear from creeping in. "I'm sorry, Jamal," Derek said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted you to go through that. I should have been able to keep you safe from that kind of confusion. It wasn't your fault, okay?" Jamal didn't answer right away, but Derek could see him nodding in the rearview mirror. He wasn't sure if Jamal understood completely, but the fact that he hadn't pulled away or shut down gave Derek a small sense of hope. Maybe they could move past this, even if it left a mark on both of them. "I just want to forget about it," Jamal said after a long pause. "Can we go get ice cream, like we were going to?" His voice was a little stronger now, a hint of his usual enthusiasm returning. Derek smiled, his heart lifting just a little. "Of course, buddy. We can get all the ice cream you want." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ice cream wouldn't fix everything, but it could be a small step toward healing, toward making the day feel a little more like the fun, carefree one it had been supposed to be. As Derek turned the car toward the ice cream shop, he realized that even though the day had taken a dark turn, there was still a chance to make it better. They could still salvage something from the wreckage. As they sat in the small shop, enjoying their ice cream, Derek watched Jamal's face light up with the familiar joy that always came when he had his favorite treat. It was a simple moment, but it meant everything. Derek knew that they would carry the weight of what had happened today for a while. But for now, they were together, and that was enough. Derek couldn't shake the lingering feeling that something had changed, not just in how the world saw them, but in how they saw themselves. There were things in the world beyond their control, things that could make a simple day into something frightening and unfair. But there was also something in the bond they shared, something stronger than the fear they had faced. As they finished their ice cream, Derek made a promise to himself. He would protect Jamal, no matter what. He would always do his best to keep him safe, but more than that, he would make sure Jamal knew he was loved, no matter what the world might throw their way. For now, though, he would focus on the simple joy of the moment, the warmth of the ice cream, the sound of Jamal laughing, and the knowledge that no matter what, they had each other. That was all that mattered. The next few days passed in a blur for Derek. He tried to focus on getting back to normal, but the events of that afternoon lingered in his mind. The park, once a place of calm and joy, now felt different to him. He couldn't help but think of the way the officer had approached them, the way Jamal had looked at him with fear in his eyes. It was hard to shake the feeling of vulnerability, of being unfairly judged, of being a target just because of who they were. But as the days went by, Derek also realized something important. The experience had changed him, yes, but it had also brought him closer to Jamal. In a strange way, it had shown them both how important they were to each other. Jamal had needed reassurance, and Derek had been there for him, even when he felt like he couldn't protect him from everything. That bond, that unspoken understanding between them, had grown stronger through the ordeal. One evening after dinner, Derek and Jamal were sitting on the porch enjoying the cool evening air. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the stars were starting to appear in the sky. It was a quiet moment, just the two of them. Jamal leaned against his father, his head resting on Derek's shoulder. "Dad," Jamal said, breaking the silence. Derek glanced down at him, noticing the serious expression on his son's face. "Yeah, buddy," Derek replied, his voice gentle. Jamal paused for a moment, as if thinking carefully about his words. "I've been thinking about what happened that day," he said softly. "And I just want you to know, I'm not scared anymore. I trust you." Derek felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected to hear that. The events of that day had shaken both of them, but here was Jamal, offering him comfort when Derek had thought he was the one who needed to reassure his son. "You do?" Derek asked, his voice a little strained. He didn't know how to respond at first. He had been so focused on protecting Jamal, on making sure he was okay, that he hadn't fully realized how much Jamal had processed on his own. "Yeah," Jamal said, nodding. "It was scary, but I know you're always going to be there for me. And I don't think anyone could ever make me feel like I'm not safe when I'm with you." Derek's heart swelled with pride and love. He had always tried to be a good father, but hearing Jamal's words made him realize just how much his son trusted him. It wasn't about protecting Jamal from every little thing. It was about being there for him, no matter what happened. "I'll always be here for you, Jamal," Derek said, his voice full of emotion. "No matter what, I'll always have your back." The two of them sat quietly for a while, watching the stars in the sky, each lost in their own thoughts, but comforted by the presence of the other. Derek couldn't help but feel that, in a way, they had both learned something important that day. It wasn't just about the fear they had experienced. It was about the strength they had found in each other. The next morning, as they prepared for another day, Derek noticed something different in Jamal's attitude. He seemed more confident, more sure of himself. Derek knew that Jamal had been affected by the events, but it seemed like he had turned a corner. He was still his bright, energetic self, but there was a maturity in the way he spoke, in the way he carried himself. Derek couldn't help but feel proud of how his son had handled everything. As they got into the car to head to school, Jamal turned to Derek with a smile. "Dad, I think I want to go back to the park this weekend," he said. "But this time, I'm going to bring my friends. We'll make it a fun day." Derek smiled back, his heart full. "That sounds like a great idea, Jamal. I'm looking forward to it." As they drove to school, Derek realized that despite the challenges they had faced, they had come out stronger. The incident had left its mark, but it hadn't broken them. They had each other, and that was what mattered. The rest of the world might have been unpredictable and unfair, but in that moment, with his son beside him, Derek felt like they could face anything. They had overcome the fear, the misunderstanding, and the uncertainty. And now, they were ready to move forward, stronger than before. The bond between them was unbreakable, and together, they could face whatever came their way.